Welcome to B2Education Unpacked, the podcast where we get under the skin of the business of education. I'm your host, Stella James, and in each episode, I'll sit down with inspiring guests from across the education sector, innovators, leaders, and change makers, to explore the trends, challenges, and opportunities shaping the future. Whether you're working in education, building solutions, or just passionate about the future of learning, you're in the right place. Let's unpack the big ideas and real stories driving education technology forward. Welcome to B2Education Unpacked, the Education Growth Podcast. Dr. Neelam Parmar just showed us AI-powered education, technology that promises to reach every learner. Matt Tiplin is about to show us what happens when it doesn't. Matt runs education at Keys Inclusion Pathways, ALFA for hybrid re-engagement, CF Education for specialist tutoring, and online schools for pupils who can't physically attend. He's building an alternative provision at scale. But what is the interesting thing is Matt was a teacher, an Ofsted inspector, and then he sold EdTech. And we worked together on OnView Learning, and now he's building a provision for children's mainstream education. Couldn't help. Matt knows my story. He knows what it's like when a parent realises mainstream isn't working and needs an alternative. So we're going to talk about whether alternative provision solves the problem or just manages it more quietly, what it means to build a commercial business around mainstream failures, and whether what he's building really actually helps the children he need it most. So Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to see you again.
We haven't seen each other for a while, but it's very good to see you.
It's great.
So how's it going at your new role?
Really well. Incredibly exciting. Keys are great to work with. Fabulous people to suit, not just fabulous kids that we're supporting. Challenges along the way so far, but it's been a few months now and no looking back.
If you don't get challenges, you're not doing it right either. Do you know what I mean?
Completely agree.
So, we're going to go straight into the questions. So I spoke to Neelam and she was talking about AI and personalised learning and the close gap at scaling and how to do that. You used to sell EdTech. We worked together on OnView Learning. Now you're building an alternative provision for kids in mainstream education that they couldn't reach. What does that journey tell us about whether EdTech actually solves the problems we claim it would?
It's a tricky question because I think EdTech, like any tool, can be used really, really well. If you know what your reason why is, why do you pick up a hammer? Well, it's because you want to put a picture on the wall. You're not going to use it for many other things, et cetera, et cetera. And I think EdTech carries the same kind of benefit. I think the downside to any new technology, particularly at a point where you could perceive it, society as a whole is adopting education technology alongside other technologies, is it can be misused, it can be overused, it can be used as a substitute for things that it shouldn't be used as a substitute for. And I think where EdTech runs the risk of falling foul in serving what it claims to be its purposes globally is it can be used really well in some cases, and those anecdotal examples are used to kind of project what it could do for everything, everybody, everywhere, all at once. And no single EdTech tool, piece of software, piece of hardware is ever going to achieve that. One of the areas that I think EdTech could really help us out, or any technology can help us with, are administrative tasks. I use AI, large language models daily to just help me do bits and pieces of work that could otherwise take quite a long time. But a critical piece of that is me doing the critical thinking around what that AI churns out for me. I think where AI and EdTech could be used really negatively is where the idea of a piece of software personalizing learning is completely misunderstood. Learning is a human experience. You can't program the human mind. The AI model at the end of a computer is not going to know the experiences, attributes, and background that a child's bringing to that experience. So at best, the personalized learning is just personalizing content distribution at volume. What happens at the other end in terms of receipt, I think, is a wholly different question. So I think EdTech has a number of advantages and a number of ways it could help if the person making the decision or people making the decision do that really wisely. But EdTech of any description, including AI, is not going to become a substitute for really effective learning experiences that children depend on.
How about in this, I'm going off Pat, but, from a scenario, from a blended learning perspective. So, obviously with Neelam, we were talking and she was explaining the blended learning models that are coming out there, but that's effectively what you're trying to create, isn't it? Is that blended?
To an extent, yes. I mean, blended insofar as a hybrid of in-person online and in-person face-to-face learning sessions alongside vocational and outdoor activity kind of sessions, enrichment, preparation for training, education, employment, routes to apprenticeship and that kind of thing is part of the package we put together. So I suppose it depends, yet to hear what Neelam had to say, but from the perspective of having some form of AI-powered kind of content management tool, like a learning management system or something, providing a teacher with mechanisms, tasks, content suggestions to support them in their delivery, I think is a wholly sensible thing. No one knows it all, and teachers, I think at the end of the day, are and certainly should be experts in progress, understanding how young people become older people, and how they go about developing the skills and attributes that the teacher themselves have deemed to be important, because that's ultimately what education's about. It's preparation for adulthood as well as love of learning at the time. So along those lines, completely agree, but never as a substitute for what should be a human experience.
So you were an Ofsted inspector, so you were judging schools.
I was.
And obviously now you run a non-school alternative provision, I won't say AP, but that gets quality assured by local authorities. Are LA's frameworks better at measuring what actually matters for children in mainstream education that couldn't reach them? For example, Luke, he was in an alternative provision. Or is it just different accountability chasing different outcomes?
It's a really complicated question, I think, because I think local authorities are pretty good at knowing about the lives and kind of challenges that children, young people, their families and carers are facing kind of day to day, more so than Ofsted that is, it's there as an inspectorate within the system. It's not the regulator. It doesn't have statutory responsibility for a child's welfare. It just checks on what the other parts of the system are doing. So the roles are slightly different. But I think kind of when I was thinking this through, nowadays, education for 4 to 18-year-olds has become synonymous with schooling. And of course, I think most adults would recognise that a lot of what they actually learn, so their lived experience of education, doesn't necessarily happen in school. What we're trying to do through Keys Inclusion Pathways is present a different answer to what an outcome is. And for us, outcome is about happy, safe learning environments, in which children can undertake, if you like, traditional learning, gaining the kind of accreditations that can be used as currency in the big wide world to go and access various different things. But more importantly, develop the skills and attributes, dispositions, aspirations, and ambitions that will enable them to become really effective members of society in adults. I think children have to feel as if they are valued, valuable. I think everyone probably needs to be able to look at themselves in the mirror and understand who they are, that sense of identity. I think education becoming synonymous with what a school does has torn some of that away, has eroded some of that fundamental purpose of what learning is all about, particularly when schools chase, accountability metrics that shouldn't be the summation of what education is. A GCSE grade does not equal a good education. A GCSE grade equals a credit in the bank that can be used to indicate certain attributes in a particular way if you then have the skill set to use it.
And I'm going to just touch on a couple of things that you're talking about, confidence in children. And, I only have to look at Luke. He was moved 2 weeks at year 10, and then he was in the alternative provision for the last year of his education. But his confidence absolutely plummeted while he was there. So what you're talking about is your outcome actually isn't it's interesting. Is it an educational outcome or is it is an educational outcome, but it's just phrased differently, isn't it?
It is. I think within this, through a school lens, school leaders that I've met, and I've been fortunate enough to meet many, many school leaders, see this done in many, many different ways. And folks will talk about, behaviours for learning or readiness to learn and all of that kind of business. In practice, from a child's perspective, it's whether or not, have they slept properly the night before? Have they woken up surrounded by an environment that they're not scared of or scared to be in? Are they therefore prepared as they walk through the school gates to deal with what they are presented with? Is the school actually the traumatic or the trauma creating environment that it shouldn't be, but isn't the safe haven that it should be? And when that child's thinking about leaving at the end of the day, does that scare the life out of them, or does it represent an opportunity to them? And at every one of those junctures, it's like that movie Sliding Doors. There are different routes that a child could take. And what we're attempting to do, and what I think, the team over at what was CF Education, now Keys Engage and Keys Tuition, and what was Alpha, now Keys Alternative Learning, what they do incredibly well is put the child at the centre of their thinking. Who is this person? What have they experienced? What do we believe they need? What do they think they need? In order to then piece together a package that gives them the ability to do something better tomorrow than they would have done otherwise. Make good decisions, look at things positively, figure out how to earn money in a safe and responsible way rather than a way that will cause them harm or cause other people harm. A really lovely story I'll share with you. One outcome that's very, very atypical is a young man that's supported through one of our programs, and his goal was simply to go to bed on time every night for a week. And if he could do that, the organisation, we would pay for him to go out for a decent breakfast one morning, and then clearly for us that provided the mechanisms to understand why it worked. Did he feel better? Yes, he did. Was he turning up on time the next day to the tuition sessions? Yes, he was. What were his reflections on, at the point where he's having breakfast? Well, he had the reward, which is a short-term thing, but he had the conversation around why it mattered. He understood what the tutor was getting at and so on. And that little scenario, that one tiny example of just going to bed on time, being rewarded, provided so many rich opportunities for conversation that are then building other foundations for that young person to kind of experience what life could be like going forward. And I think that's brilliant.
Oh, no, it is heartwarming. And I think the impact it can have on a child is massive. One teacher that's giving their time, and I've seen it in an alter where you've got so many different types of children, some from not great backgrounds as well, and it's not their fault. And Luke comes from a good background, but then he's mixed in with characters and I think it took, he wanted to learn, but he didn't know how. And I think that is the biggest, and that's what you're trying to achieve, really.
I think so. It's about presenting to somebody who might not understand the value or the purpose of themselves in the world, or indeed kind of what schooling represents, is to present an image or an opportunity to understand that, learning certain skills and attributes and kind of ways of kind of getting through the day could be really valuable, and you can contribute to society in a manner that everyone else also recognizes as being good and valuable. And I think when push comes to shove, most people, most of the time, want to be good. It's about having the opportunity to do that, and that doesn't necessarily always work out, but if we can do something to present that opportunity, then all the better. Obviously,
you're building something in regards to reaching those children that mainstream education couldn't reach. But when you pitch to parents, say for example me, are you promising to fix the mainstream that's broke, or are you just offering a different kind of failure but more quietly?
That's a really fair question. I think prevention is always better than cure. So I think in an ideal world, what we refer to as mainstream would be resource rich enough, be talent rich enough to be able to support children given their starting points. But the reality is that the system itself, the education system or the school system that we recognise in England at least, is predicated on like an industrial batching model where it's age, not stage of development that prefaces everything. From teacher training through to what a child gets as a grade at the end of a particular period of learning is all done based on this conveyor belt system. And the challenge with that is not necessarily that mainstream is broken, but it's just answering a question that may well have been suitable at some point in the past, but it's not the right question anymore. As a progressive society, if we value everyone as an individual and we respect and promote and encourage individuality, whatever that may mean, and individual aspiration, and recognize skills and attributes in people that can really do some wonderful things, then we have to have an education system that enables that. I mean, this morning on my way into town, I was listening to an interview of the Ukrainian president, and he was reflecting to Alistair Campbell on this idea that, on day one of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what was going through his head? Was he panicking or anything else? He said, no, I just thank God that I had a good enough education, whatever that meant to him, to have the ability to think through what was going on while chaos was surrounding him. And I thought, wow, that's a really simple summing up of what education is supposed to be about.
Yeah,
and he pointed back to the fact that he had a good education in order to give him the skills to do something going forward. So to your question, are we trying to fix something by kind of failing more quickly? Absolutely not. Frankly, I'm trying to reframe what good education looks like, given children and their starting points as individuals, as opposed to assuming that just because you're 16, you're then capable of doing a GCSE at that age, and then that GCSE is worthwhile and valuable for whatever you intend to do next. For the majority, that may well be true. I suspect that we are in a situation where the majority of children are learning while at school, learning how to tolerate being at school. Ken Robinson is he did a great RSA anime. We're sat in the RSA now. He did a great video that was very influential in my career as a teacher. And he said, look, this whole idea of the system being industrial just doesn't work. You batch kids and you have these outputs, but what are we actually teaching them to do? We're almost teaching children how to be less creative because they have to conform to standards. And those standards may well have existed for a purpose that was valuable at some point, but I don't believe that's true anymore. And then we hear from industry, and the NFER, I think, published a report late last year that said increasingly workplaces are seeing that young people are turning up to them without the skills they need to be successful.
I think we see it everywhere.
Yeah. So, what the hell are schools doing then? If they're not answering a fundamental question, which is how does a child become an adult, then what's the point? And I think that's the question they need to really get on board.
And it's really interesting you say that, because one thing that I do recognise with Luke was what he learned while he was in school. And yes, he did his English and maths, and all of his subjects were stripped away. But he did a GCSE in finance. What is VAT? What is your tax? That's so valuable, because we don't teach our children this before they go into the working world, or when they're 18. And then and basic life things about finances and budgeting and all. And he is absolutely scrupulous now with his finances. He has a spreadsheet, and and he didn't get that from school. No. He got that from the AP. Yeah. Completely. So do you think that's where education has to change? I know I'm going off the questions, and we might be repeating ourselves, because it has to change somewhere.
Yeah, I think the attempt that, the current SEND reforms and the white paper and so on I think the attempt they're going for, the thing they're pitching for, is in recognition of everything we've just run through. The education system, it's not broken, it's just highly fragmented, dependent on other services that are underfunded and so on.
Yeah.
But the logic follows that if teachers are going to become a centre of a child's developmental existence, regardless of formal schooling definitions, then of course more should happen in schooling. It stands to reason. It's a single point of delivery. But what the SEND reforms in the white paper, I think, will fail to achieve is a cultural shift in what does a child need to experience between the ages of 2 and 18, or any age, in order to go on and be successful and contribute to society. And for that, it's slightly philosophical, I suppose, but we need to define what society means and what it is.
And what they need.
What they need, And clearly there are challenges that are often cited, and not pop psychologists, but, in a world where children are very quickly distracted, and as many adults are as well, by whatever kind of media they happen to be tapping into, that's the space, the education space, what children pick up in order to develop little skills to do, like the books or the washing or cooking, is ever more contested. So to an extent, it's no wonder schools struggle increasingly to maintain the attention span of some children, because they're operating in a space where if they're not more interesting than the social media equivalent, then of course they're not going to command that child's attention. And when that child's attention isn't commanded in school, that's where old-fashioned concepts of discipline kick in. behavior policies that are predicated on conduct issues as opposed to behaviors as communication kick in. And then, the child winds up in a position where they're no longer in the school because they don't fit the system. No. And that isn't right. And yet we know all of we know a lot of those causal factors. We understand, that it's just kind of series of events, but we seem to struggle to do anything about it. And that for me can only boil down to a cultural inertia that surrounds, school's a school and everyone knows what it is because as adults, we've all been to school. So it's as if that model can persist. And I think we need to challenge that assumption.
Well, society's changed. But look at how our society, even since we were kids, look how society has changed since then. So, I think you're right. I think it's a massive culture change that needs to happen. It will take a while, but...
Well, our values have shifted. 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 10 years ago, our values as a society, just in England, let alone the rest of the UK and the rest of the world, were fundamentally different to what they are today. You see that in all different kind of theatres. So how do you overcome the problem that is a big institution that is the school system also being agile enough to reflect the shifting values of society? Well, I think you need solutions that are built around the individuals in that system as opposed to looking at the system as the answer in and of itself.
Because ironically, though, you're representing mainstream failure in lots of ways, but you're building, and I'm going to ask you to explain what these are, ALFA, CF Education, an online school. So ALFA, so that is?
So Alpha is alternative learning for all. It's now called Keys Alternative Learning. So one of my very first jobs, if you like, when I joined Keys, was to take a look at the suite of non-school alternative provision that we have and present that offer such that any stakeholder, child through to local authority commissioner, kind of understood what we're offering as a solution to the problem that they're presenting to us. So Keys Engage and Keys Tuition sat and sits within what was CF Education, which is a wonderful organisation that Keys acquired back in November, just as I joined. And they've got years and years worth of experience providing tuition, both in the academic sense and the vocational sense as well, through to engagement and stabilisation, almost social work for children and youngsters for whom school either hasn't worked out or is yet to be engaged with on any particular level for a range of reasons. So Keys Engage and Keys Tuition sit as, if you like, very deliberate, bespoke part-time offers for children and young people to re-engage and reintegrate into what we currently refer to as mainstream education. Keys Alternative Learning is very similar, but in that case, it's a package offer of face-to-face online and vocational and outdoor activities designed to do a very similar job to Engage in Tuition, but for children for whom that slightly more structured approach over the course of the week is appropriate. So that'll be kind of a part-time or a short-term intervention and supporting children who have on their EHCP education other than at school listed, so EOTAS, which is a great solution.
So you're building it at scale. So you're building a business model around mainstream failures. I know I keep using the word failures. Are you solving the problem or just managing the symptoms profitably?
So although, I am critical of the way the mainstream system can work at times, I don't think it's failing. So if you like, I disagree with the premise because the reality is the majority of the children, the majority of the time do attend a mainstream school of some form or another. But I think it's the issue is the word mainstream because it suggests that, by definition, mainstream is othering those who don't fit into mainstream. So what's not a mainstream? Well, it's the edges, it's the alternatives. But for those children, the others, the alternatives are their everything. So I think the issue is less about whether or not we're kind of managing around an issue. It's a question of whether or not the system can adjust to represent and reflect the way society is composed today. And children do deserve the chance on their own terms to be as successful as possible. There are clearly certain things that all children do need and should learn. The ability to communicate effectively, the ability to manipulate and work with number, the ability to socialize and communicate with one another and adults around them, amongst other things. But they also need to do that in a world that exists today, not a world that was dreamt up in the Victorian era that the school system today is predicated on. So how that then kind of pans out is part of what we want to be a part of, and that shift.
So do you believe you are actually solving the problem and not just managing the symptoms again with...
Yeah, we offer a specialist non-school alternative to answer the question of what an education for a young person for whom school is not appropriate could look like. And I think it's that sense of being specialist as opposed to alternative, bespoke up to the point where clearly we can deliver what we say we can deliver. We don't overpromise and underdeliver. We have to be careful about that. But that specialist service that thinks about what that young person really needs to engage or re-engage is a critical component of what we do.
Most EdTech companies sign distribution partners, hand them a brochure, and wonder why nothing happens. If your resellers aren't selling, it's not them, it's your system. Distribution partner management for EdTech fixes that. Visit sevensibling.co.uk. So you're scaling alternative provision across key group pathways, but the provision that worked for my son worked because it was small, personal and relational. Exactly what you were talking about. It's about personalised learning for the individual child. Can you actually deliver that on a commercial scale? Or does growth inevitably mean that more children fall through the cracks?
It's a really good question. It's something we think about a lot. I mean, Key's epic values, so excellence, passion, integrity, care, sit at the heart. I mean, it's the DNA of everything you do. You meet any other person who works with or for Keys and you'll get similar kinds of answers. Building Keys inclusion pathways, we are not a stack it high and sell it cheap kind of offer. We absolutely recognise, and I've seen it myself, right? If you don't have the personal element to that, nobody's going to believe you. Trust and confidence is a massive part of what we do and want to build, because otherwise the relationship that will underpin the kind of experience a young person has with us will never develop. And everything is relationship driven. It has to be, and you can only do that in person. How we do that is tricky because we have to ensure that we're hiring the right people at the right time in the right geography. But that's what we're committed to do, to ensure that what a child experiences is what they need in order to engage or re-engage and reintegrate into the way in which the system currently is. If we weren't doing that, it would be foolhardy, because as much as I think the system needs to change, it isn't for the time being. Therefore, we have to deal with the reality we're presented with. But what we can do in achieving that and working with a young person can be really highly tailored. Online delivery helps with that, just from a practical operational point of view. It does come with risks around, what's going on at the end of the line and things that we have to think about from a safeguarding point of view and so on. But from what we've seen so far, it's really achievable.
What percentage would you say go back into mainstream from your programs?
A high percentage at the moment. I think part of the challenge in answering that question precisely is that for some children and young people, mainstream was never appropriate. Therefore, it's not as if reintegration is appropriate, because the is a false premise. But for children for whom it's appropriate to reintegrate into mainstream school or specialist schooling of some description, it's absolutely our intention to ensure that they get there so that they're then back on the treadmill heading towards whatever comes next for them.
And what percentage would you say, and this is a bit of a punt really, but what percentage is technology and what percentage is one-to-one?
Really good question. I mean, it depends. So within Keys inclusion pathways, if you can imagine on the left-hand side, you've got Keys engage and Keys tuition. Keys engage virtually no technology at all. All very, very relationship driven, personal kind of touch points and so on, through to Keys Tuition, where an increasing proportion, maybe at most 20%, might be online delivery. But again, such is the nature of the young person's need for confidence building, development of a relationship, to then access that education. The likelihood is face-to-face is appropriate. We then move into Keys Alternative Learning, where maybe we're heading towards something like a quarter to maybe half of what a child experiences might be online versus outdoor activity or face-to-face tuition. And then by the point we get to the fourth element that we're just developing now, the online school, that will be exclusively online. Our intention is to meet the standards of the DFE, so the Online Education Accreditation Standards, and that demands completely online delivery from what I've seen of the reports so far.
It's interesting because that's almost, I've sort of just answered the question, do you use EdTech in your pathways? So you've just answered that. And what's different about how you use it versus how a school would use technology? I don't, in the word EdTech, I would like to call it education technology, because I think it just is such a wide span. Did working in educational tech sales give you an idea of what to do and what not to do? I know there's two separate questions there, really.
Yeah, I think that dealing with the second part, what to do and what not to do, absolutely. And you and I both had a great luxury and a privilege of meeting lots of different vendors that do some really fabulous things and answer some really niche through to quite broad questions, depending on who the vendor was. So having a sense of the options out there, albeit there are more options arriving on the market every day, is certainly helpful. Back to your original question, so more along the lines of kind of what does it do differently for us? Not a great deal. A few years ago, I attended a conference and I was listening to a speaker from the EdTech Alliance, who I presume is still about, but they presented a diagram that was effectively, it's almost like an organogram showing all of the different education technologies that might serve certain administrative purposes, certain like LMS, to content delivery purposes, management information system, all sorts of different things. And I was looking at that diagram just very recently, thinking about the online school, to almost go through and cross off what we wouldn't need to use. And there were only two things of the 50 different edutech kind of tools that a school might need. And it was a local Wi-Fi network and a local area network. That was it. Because otherwise you're going to need other forms of hardware, one end or the other of the line. You're going to need all the software. You're going to need the management information system. So a lot of it is exactly the same. How we use it requires a different thought process on the part of the teachers and tutors that work with us, because the kinds of tasks and activities and pedagogical techniques that those folks are going to need to use to engage our children, young people, are going to be different. But the technology itself is there. And it's just a question of how we use it and manipulate it to best serve the outcomes we're aiming for.
Do you think alternative provision is misrepresented in education technology? Do you think? Because you're very niche, and actually I don't think there's much technology. I know you, Everway, they've got those from a Send and, all of those type of areas. But I think because of alternative provision's nature, I think it can get a little bit missed, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. I mean, it's purely my opinion, right? I don't have any data to back this up, but I mean, it stands to reason mainstream and independent mainstream are big sectors. They're worth and contain a lot of money. So as a business, of course, you're going to go after the big bucks. I think that represents an advantage, and also, for obvious reasons, a distinct disadvantage, because one size doesn't fit all and so on. But it's the one size that doesn't fit all part of the market that we're operating in, or put the sector. And so there is an element of us having to figure out how to fit square pegs into round holes at times. But one of the things I know that we're committed at Keys is finding ways around that, or finding solutions to meet the problem we're actually being presented with. And we're just determined to find the best solution for that.
I'm going to ask you, so obviously you've got two children.
I do,
yeah. And they're both in secondary school. Would you send them to one of your alternative provisions?
Yeah, absolutely, if that's what they needed. Without hesitation. it's difficult without sounding kind of trite or soppy about it. But the people that I'm lucky to work with and work within the teams across the provisions I've described are just awesome people. You know, these folks come from all different backgrounds, many from teaching backgrounds, many from social care backgrounds, and everything in between. And they share a common view that, you know, children deserve a chance to be brilliant at whatever it is they choose to go off and be brilliant at. And it's not about blaming the child for how they're presenting when they kind of first meet us. They very much have the attitude of, okay, this is where we're starting and this is where we intend to get to, and we'll figure out a way to get there. So wouldn't hesitate for either of the kids to work with the folks that work with me in order to kind of move themselves further along their journey. So yeah.
And it's interesting you say that, because, you know, I've seen it hands-on, the people that are in alternative provisions. They have one advantage over mainstream, I think, as well, because the groups are smaller, but the children are more challenging. You know, I've seen it where they just get up and walk out. My son's done that. They, you know, they don't want to be at school that day, so therefore it's not happening. But I do think they're very unique human beings in the sense of their patience and the adaptability of how they think on their feet, you know, I know it's adaptive learning and it's at its best in that sort of environment.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I mean, it's a colleague that's sat listening to this that's got a class of 30 to deal with on Monday morning is going to be thinking, yeah, there's a volume issue there, and so on and so forth, and adaptive teaching or differentiation. I mean, it's a different rose by another name. Right? I mean, ultimately, what folks are trying to do in those big classes is to figure out a way to deliver the content that the curriculum suggests they should deliver in the right order to that group and have it stick somehow to then be tested by somebody else down the line. Fine, that's the system that we've decided is a good one for us. I think the advantage that school AP and non-school AP has is not necessarily being so beholden to some of those strictures and restrictions, and being able to think, I mean, you know, for a child for whom, you know, perhaps home, whatever that means to them, is just chaotic and noisy, getting to school is fraught with danger and difficulty for one reason or another. Being at school, what they need is a bit of peace and quiet maybe now and again. And yet nowadays, schools are under such pressure to deliver for accountability reasons and whatnot, that the likelihood of a teacher just sitting there and saying to one or more children, you know what, we're going to spend the next hour doing absolutely nothing. You know what, kids, learn how to just be bored for an hour, be with yourself.
Yeah.
It can make a massive difference, but the likelihood of that happening in a mainstream scenario is low. The likelihood of that happening with us, if done in the right way for the right reasons, can be relatively high. And maybe that's what children need at times, particularly when there's all these other social media distractions and the rest going on. Maybe kids just need to relearn how to be bored now and again.
And it's interesting. So, you know, I think when we were working together, we talked about teachers being superheroes and things like that. Yeah. And I remember, you know, Zachary, he was good at school. He was cheeky, but he was really good. And when it came to his final year of GCSE, one teacher just made, and it's that quiet moment that she was able to, and not every teacher's going to have that luxury as to sit with him and go, right, okay, how are we going to get you through these exams? But that's a rarity. You don't, you know, and I know we're talking about mainstream now, but you just don't get that. The world is too busy, isn't it?
Well, it's the busyness that can often feel daunting. I mean, you know, it can feel daunting for many adults, but adults, you know, are supposed to have the skills and whatnot to kind of deal with it one way or the other. For children, particularly children that don't have necessarily the kind of upbringing that one would hope or expect or anticipate or whatever, you know, whatever the challenges may be, that, you know, somewhat by design or by just sheer fluke of happenstance and by accident or whatnot. For those kids, school needs to be, or the education system has to be, a place where they can anticipate feeling better about themselves at the end of the day, in whatever manner that means. And some of that quite clearly has to involve gaining the kinds of qualifications that the rest of society use as proxies for whether or not they're going to be useful to them in the future. The difficulty with that presumption or that model is that just because a child doesn't have a particular qualification doesn't mean they're not useful and have value and can feel valuable. And I think it's part of the kind of the dirty secret of the way in which the sector can feel at times to some of these children is actually, if I'm not within the top however many that get reading, writing, maths at primary, or English GCSE and maths GCSE and 5 A stars, or whatever the old metrics are and how they're translated today. Well, if you're not in that percentage, then what are you? Well, it's not that you're nothing. You are something, and you have value.
And you're a cog in society, aren't you? We are a cog in society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we just need to figure that out better.
If you're building, marketing, or growing something in the education sector, this is the podcast to listen to. Subscribe to B2Education Unpacked whenever you listen, and I'll see you there next week. You were an Ofsted inspector judging schools. Now you're running provision that serves the children those schools can't manage. Looking back at your time as an inspector, were you judging schools fairly? Or were you holding them accountable for outcomes with children you now understand are incredibly difficult to reach?
To be honest, I think it's both. I think absolutely fairly, because, a school's a school is a school, and, the inspectorate is there to determine the extent to which what the regulator, the DfE, has come up with is being delivered by the people at the chalk face, the schools. And that framework exists, and now exists in a slightly different form. But, there is a framework that's applied fairly to all these schools, give or take the odd inspector that might not do it as well as others. Everyone's human. I think ultimately that same framework and inspection methodology being applied in the same way is fair. The second part, however, around understanding the extent to which outcomes matter and how they inform a judgment, that's quite a different story. And I think the development of the framework from the point when I became an HMI in 2016 to today, the way the framework's developed to look at, curriculum coherency from whether or not a particular subset of a cohort 1 year happened to be particularly well according to a set of external exams and so on. That's a development, not necessarily a good one, but it's a development. And the way in which the framework operates now with, scorecards and removal of overarching judgments and all that kind of business is a development. Again, somewhat dealing with symptom, not cause, but nonetheless, it is what it is. My problem, if you like, with the way in which Ofsted operate nowadays, and was true then, is while a school's inspection judgment may well be fair and reasonable given the application of what we had to apply, the aggregation, if you've added all of those inspection judgments up to then present an aggregated view of the way the sector is working, I felt that there was always an error in that. Because one, it would drive unintended outcomes, the industries that get created because Ofsted decide that something is in focus or something needs to be worked on. So school leaders all rush out to buy EdTechs that solve particular problems or whatever the case may be. So that's unhelpful. And I think, by definition, schools are supposed to serve communities that they're situated in. So there are bound to be differences in delivery and outcome that possibly should exist for a variety of reasons, not necessarily in terms of the quality of the outcome, but the type of outcome might need to shift. And the difficulty is that if the framework is applied in a standard format, what you will get is an attempt at standard outcomes. And standard outcomes, as we've already described, is not what education is really about. If you look at it across the lifetime of a person, it's about learning things as they come. It's about making mistakes. It's about doing things differently to another person because a person is different to somebody else. And I think that was the challenge for me. You look back at kind of Ofsted's annual reports, and increasingly special educational needs came into focus as being an area of development or concern, but just because it was identified doesn't necessarily mean that the way in which that report is interpreted and the solutions are arrived at were ever correct. So that's kind of where that system stops, and then it's left down to people to make individual decisions or group decisions or research-informed decisions to come up with solutions. And that, for me, represents a challenge when the solution was never, the part of the solution was never going to be to look at the system itself. It was to deal with, right, this is the structure that we've got. How can we make it run more efficiently? And that doesn't, for me, do the job. That's not what an inspection should be about when you're looking at it system-wide. What it should be about is saying, the system might not work. We don't need to go from a busted Ford Cortina to a Ferrari. We need an airplane now. Mm-hmm. We need something completely different. And that for me is where the challenge around the way in which, if you like, Ofsted fits into that broader system. It's not an Ofsted issue, it's a systems issue.
When you were, obviously you never went into alternative provisions, it was always, your mainstream schools. But now you've seen quite a few different worlds over the last 10 years, because it's been 10 years. Do you think knowing more about alternative provision, and, there is SEND in that as well, do you think you could have been tough on some schools, or do you...
Well, as an inspector?
Yeah. Do you think you've opened yourself up more now that you've seen so many different walks in life from an educational point of view, and especially the alternative provision? I know you don't get monitored by Ofsted, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, non-school AP don't. School AP do. So I did inspect some that were school alternative provisions. But yeah, I mean, in answer to your actual question around opening my eyes to things, absolutely. I started my career in a grammar school in southwest London. I mean, it's quite a different kind of environment to some of those that I've kind of inspected, visited, worked alongside, run, and so on since. The challenges are there; they're just different, and that is simply the truth. But certainly, I mean, it's opened my eyes to what I was getting at the top, really, around schools and education not being the same thing, and the challenge that then arrives. If you're a head teacher who recognises that the cohort of year 11s this year of a secondary school have a particular set of attributes that would lend themselves really well to certain career paths that aren't dominated by, university degree, A-level, and so on. How do you go about demonstrating that you're doing right by them while simultaneously meeting the need or the demands of an accountability system that assumes certain things that are driving you towards university or whatever? It's incredibly difficult. Yeah. So I think I'm certainly a lot more sympathetic to that than the fairly perhaps blinkered view that I had when I started my career.
Softened with age.
Yeah, maybe.
When a child completes one of your pathways, so let's take Alpha and CF Education on online school, and you look back at their journey, I know you're new in role, but there will be some evidence there that you will see. What does successful actually look like? Because it is very different, like you've just said, from mainstream education. Is it qualification? Is it attendance? Is, like you mentioned earlier, safeguarding? Are they safe? Or is it something entirely different?
Yeah, it's all of those things, because it has to be built around the child. I mean, I think it's very difficult, and I think it'd be wrong of me to try and summarise, if you like, the profile of child that we support, because that's exactly what I think is wrong with like mainstream education. Or not wrong, it's a challenge they have to face,
It's there, but yeah.
But, to give you a few examples, we've had, I've been really lucky to meet some children, young people recently who have, some in care, who have just learned how to engage in a sense of what they might be in the future. So they're now doing work experience because of the support we've given them. Some of that involved formal qualifications, functional skills. Some of it was as simple as, day-to-day domestic skills and that kind of thing. Another young person that I met a couple of weeks ago was thrilled. She came in, didn't worry that she was walking straight into a meeting, going bowled in, which was brilliant. And she was over the moon. She just found out that she'd passed her functional skills in maths, waiting on the English result, walked out, came back 5 minutes later. The person I was speaking to knew she'd passed that as well. She was like, just give it 5 minutes. Sure enough, came back in over the moon. And this is a young person whose life could go very, very differently for a variety of reasons that were down to that, kind of idiosyncratic to them. I've shared the story earlier on about the young person for whom just going to bed rather than gaming till 4 a.m. For a solid week, that is a really, really great outcome that will lead to something else then being possible. And it's the something else that the team are now working on. So it's really difficult because outcome for us means something, and all of those things. It is about attending. It is about engaging with us. It's about developing confidence and resilience and just showing up. And for us, it means showing up, not being late, being consistent, being a safe haven in a world that to that young person might seem utterly chaotic, because they don't have the advantage of that year's worth of adult experience where they kind of they have the war wounds to recognize what might happen to them. It's all new to them. So, for us, it creates a series of demands and challenges that we really are excited to meet. And it's tricky and it's tough, but it's the right thing to do. But yeah, I mean,
it's incredible. I think you've nailed life nailed it on its head with just showing up. If we can and it's hope as well, isn't it? By just them showing up, they've got hope and confidence, and it brings everything else into play as well. Absolutely. And I think, and just talking to you then, I could see in your face that, that genuine sparkle of like, actually, this is really good. We're making a big difference to it might be a smaller section of children, but just them walking away, that young girl with that, whereas if she was in, and this is not a dig at mainstream because they're different, but if she was in mainstream, she would never have felt that way, most probably.
No.
And it's not mainstream's fault, but it's just different.
No, and it's that point around the way it makes you feel, I think, is really important. And it's not, again, being wishy-washy or soppy or, lacking scientific rigor or anything like that. But at the end of the day, how something, an event, a person makes you feel is critical to how you end the day and how you start the next one. And what we're determined to do is provide a point of consistency that enables young people to feel better about themselves, so that, the vast majority probably should go into mainstream or specialist education full-time to move through the system that, faults and all, will ultimately allow them to step onto whatever comes next for them. That's our aim. If in the process we're able to just nudge the system in the right direction as we go, fantastic. I'd love it to change quicker, but I'm a pragmatist as well, so we'll do what we can.
So in the next episode, we've got Al Kingsley. So we're going to be talking about, obviously, his business's operational infrastructure. It's not the most sexiest things, you'll know me saying that, but it keeps schools running and trust as well. So you're building infrastructure for children that mainstream can't serve. So if you could change one thing about how mainstream schools operate, their systems, their structure, their accountability, that would mean fewer children needing alternative provision, what would that be?
God, one thing only is a really, really tricky ask, Stella.
I might give you two.
Yeah, maybe two. Incredibly generous of you.
No more.
I think it has to boil down to accountability. An education system that is underpinned by accountability, metrics, measures, understanding, evaluations that motivate kind of the levers to be pulled in the right direction. I mean, if I was to rebuild the education system, I'd build it on the basis of high trust and high accountability. So you hire people that have the qualifications, the expertise to be recruited in the first place. You then give them the agency to make decisions, to deliver the subjects they've chosen they want to be specialist in the manner they think is best. And then you figure out the best way to understand the extent to which a young person is achieving those aims. And, broad brush. I taught geography because I felt it was really important for young people to understand the way the world works, one way or the other. That's why I got into geography. I didn't get into being a teacher for grades, certainly not for the money or any of that kind of thing. Pension's good, but, it doesn't solve all those other issues, blah, blah, blah. And I think that sense of having high trust and high accountability is critical. And I don't believe, based on what I hear, what I'm told, what I read, I don't believe that's where we're at today. A lot of systems change is actually just structure and process improvement, making things more efficient. The application of new technologies and new tools is about achieving the same, efficiency, as opposed to kind of systemic change that enables a greater view of what a good outcome could look like. And I said at the top, learning is a really human experience. And how we go about enabling every young person to feel as if that experience is open to them, I think it is both tricky, but it's something we have to aspire towards. Learning is like the interview I was talking about earlier on, Vladimir Zelensky talking about his education, giving him the foundation on which to make some incredibly difficult decisions at a point where, there are all kinds of threats to him personally and an existential one to the country. It's an extreme example, I get that. But, if it can do that for somebody in that position, it can do similarly, given context, to anybody. And yet, if you think about it this way, it's come the summertime, children will receive in England and across the UK summative examination results, GCSEs, A levels, BTECs, and others, which is great. And for them, it will mean something profound and a real kind of milestone in their lives. Teachers and head teachers will look at their results and start forming school development plans for the following year, or updating improvement plans that they might already have. But that cohort of children isn't the one they're dealing with the next year. They're a new cohort.
Mm-hmm.
The teachers are likely to have changed to some extent or another. There'll be a churn. So how ready is that school to meet the challenges of the year ahead, particularly in an accountability system as it exists today, where schools were getting themselves into such a 2 and 8 about the way in which they went about assessing. Ofsted stopped allowing schools to demonstrate or show their own assessment data, through inspection. So how do they go about doing that without enabling teachers and the staff on the ground to do the very best they can, given what they think is best, given their knowledge and understanding of those children and young people? The answer is they can't very easily, because they'll feel as if they're straitjacketed. And that can't be the case. As if children recognise that teachers are doing things just because they have to, then that relationship will be stymied. The barriers will go up. And as soon as a challenge arises, it will be the structure that is the problem and get in the way of what the solution could become. And I think that has to change. But high trust and high accountability is fundamental to achieving that change.
So what you're saying is, you've said it a few times actually through the podcast, is about what is education? What does it look like? Because every school, every cohort is different, isn't it? Everyone that comes in, so every year is going to be doing, some are going to be better than other years. And I suppose you've got accountability, but then that accountability will change every single year.
Yeah. If you treat accountability as an understanding of what you owe as educationalists to the people you are there to educate, then absolutely it will change depending on who those youngsters are and what experiences and everything else they bring to the table. Every class I ever taught was different. Even though, my lesson plans would be broadly similar, the content, geography is geography. It's been around since the start of the earth, it's maps and stuff. All of that stuff would be the same. The trick to being the teacher for me was understanding how was I going to deliver this information? How was I going to stop and check? All of the practice that, decent teachers will recognize as being decent practice. You try and do that. But the accountability for me was whether or not, if you like, the start of the next lesson, the children would walk in. A, they'd walk in, right? B, they'd walk in happy. They were keen to hear what we were going to do next. They were keen to engage. They were part of the team. And that I think is something that reflects the fact that I was lucky enough to work in an environment where I was trusted and I was certainly held to account. I enjoyed that. I felt safe in that environment. And for me, particularly early in my career, that was really important. I knew which way was up and down, but I had the latitude to deliver geography in a manner that I thought was interesting and exciting. With the students I taught, they're in their 30s now, but ultimately they can kind of tell you themselves whether or not it was any good. But I felt that was really important. So adjusting that sense of accountability is key. Otherwise, what's the point?
Do you miss it?
Teaching? Yeah, I loved being a teacher. I thought
Would you go back?
You know what? That's really difficult for boring reasons. To have a mortgage and a family, I don't think, frankly, I could afford it nowadays. Just given that I'm now in my 40s and my life is, it's kind of geared in a slightly different way. But I'd certainly encourage young people to get into teaching, because I think you can experience something and be a part of people's lives in a manner that very few other professions allow you to do. And I think that's awesome. You make change. And I've been really lucky, now and again, former students reach out, and this is it is a stroking ego thing. There's no two ways about it. It's nice when people get in touch and say, you taught me this and it's now helpful. And you meet people now and again, because it's a small world, who you taught, and they'll give you a nice reflection. It's one thing. Maybe the other 99% wasn't so great. Who knows? But that's a nice thing. So it feels good. But I think the difference that you can see yourself making as a teacher or a tutor can be really quite profound. And I think if you stick to that belief that you are making a change, then yeah, what could go wrong? You know,
I
that's not
think
a bad thing.
it's not, isn't it? It's making change. It's having an impact on one individual. And I think if you can have that change. So I'm going to think that's quite a nice close from that point of view. So I'd like to say thank you so much for coming in, Matt. I know you've had a really, really busy day. In our next episode, we have Elle Kingsley. Matt just showed us about alternative provision, building infrastructure for children mainstream education couldn't reach. Al runs Net Support, chairs governance boards and sits on the DfE advisory board. He's inside the mainstream operational systems that Matt's provision exists to work around. And the question is, if people building the alternatives and the people running the systems were in the same room, what would they actually change? So the next time on B2Education Unpacked, the Education podcast, join us with Elle Kingsley. Thank you very much. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you for turning up and thank you for being here. I really, really do appreciate it. Do me one last favour, just press the subscribe and then you'll get notified of all of our amazing podcasts.